Well, finally, with the Wall Street Journal in 2020 and Congress, okay, in on this case, finally, with this pressure, the FDA relented, and they approved the sensor pad in December of 1995. However, it's hard to believe this is true, but it is. Okay, the FDA was to have the perhaps not the final word, but the FDA still got their licks in, okay, because they only approved it with a doctor's prescription, okay, not for sale at a store. Right? It was then, even 2 years later. 2 years later, it was finally approved for sale, and you can now buy one, which is where I bought the one I'm demonstrating for you. Now, this is just one example, and I'll be the first to say that it's an extreme example, extreme case of FDA failure. But the reason that I bring up this example is not just to beat up on the FDA, although sometimes that's important too, but it's because this story actually, I think we can learn quite a bit from this story. It illustrates a number of important lessons. For example, other countries sometimes do a better job of approval. As I mentioned, the sensor pad was approved in Canada within 90 days. It was approved in Japan and Western Europe, and so forth. Okay? And this historically has been true not just for products, but also for pharmaceuticals. From approximately 1970 to 1993, and I'll talk about why change in 93, but from approximately that time, the FDA clearly lagged behind its counterparts in the United Kingdom, France, and Spain, and Germany in approving new drugs. And this provided an interesting test case on how safe and effective the FDA is, because we can ask, did speedier drug approval in Europe lead to a scourge of unsafe drugs? What were the consequences of the fact that the Europeans were quicker and the FDA was slower? If the US system resulted in appreciably safer drugs, then we would expect to see far fewer post-market safety withdrawals in the United States than in other countries. Okay? So if other countries are too quickly approving drugs, we ought to then see that later on they change their minds and withdraw those drugs compared to the United States. Well, what are the facts? Well, when comparing safety withdrawals in the United States with those in Great Britain and Spain, each of whom approved more drugs than the United States during the same time period, okay? Approximately 3% of all drugs were withdrawn for safety reasons in the United States, approximately 3% in Spain, approximately 4% in Great Britain. So there was no evidence that the lag in the United States produced more safety. In fact, quite the opposite. Right? Drug lag can kill. Here was a review. In view of the clear benefits demonstrable from some of the drugs introduced into Britain, it appears that the United States has lost more than it has gained from adopting a more conservative approach. Deaths, in fact, owing to the drug lag, some people have estimated them in the hundreds of thousands. Big numbers. Wardell estimated that tens of thousands of people may have died who would have lived if new drugs had been available sooner in the United States. If beta blockers were available in the United States at the same time as they were available in Great Britain and much of Europe, Wardell estimates that tens of thousands of people would have lived who in fact ended up dying. I should point out that the deaths here occur not from delay relative to Europe, of course, but from delay, period. This is any time, right, that the FDA performs or requires more safety and efficacy testing, okay, yes, it is true, this probably has some benefits in that the drugs which do reach the market are safer. However, it also means that good drugs, drugs which could be saving lives, these drugs are also delayed. And when you delay a good drug, that is costly. That means that people who could have lived or could have had reduced morbidity, they end up dying, or they end up being in much worse shape than they otherwise might have been. So drug lag, and not just drug lag relative to Europe, but drug lag delay can be very, very costly. Well, this motivates one potential reform. Thinking about this motivates one potential reform called reciprocity. Okay? And the idea is very simple. In fact, it seems to me this is a no-brainer, okay, in that other countries sometimes make better approval decisions. So if another country, like Britain or Germany, if they approve a medical device or a drug, that device or drug ought to get automatic approval in the United States, say within 90 days, unless the FDA, specifically wants to object. Right? After all, Great Britain and Germany are perfectly reasonable countries. They have perfectly sound systems for drug evaluation. Why do we need 2 or 3 or 4 agencies to duplicate the same research, to duplicate the same testing procedures, testing requirements? Okay? If Great Britain or Germany, if these say it's okay, there ought to be a prima facie case that it's okay in the United States. After all, think about it this way. Okay? Suppose that you were living in Great Britain, okay? Or in Germany, somewhere else in Europe. Suppose you were living in Great Britain and you got sick, okay? And you went to your doctor, and the doctor said, well, I think you need this drug. Would you ask your doctor, doctor, has this drug been approved by the FDA? Probably not. You wouldn't go to your doctor and say, if you were in Germany, look, I'm going to take drugs which have been approved by the FDA because the FDA is the gold standard, and I don't want anything else. I don't want any of your German drugs, okay? It's not good enough for me. Probably you wouldn't do that. Most Germans don't do that. In fact, I don't know any Germans who do that. Okay? All right. Okay. Second kind of lesson from the sensor pad story. Why was the sensor pad ultimately approved? And we want to think about that question. Why was it ultimately approved? It was ultimately approved because during the brief window of time that the product was available, doctors and patients learned what was going on. Okay? They learned that the FDA was preventing the marketing of a valuable product. Now, this is not the usual situation. As I mentioned, the manufacturers of the sensor pad were bold, were highly unusual in defying the FDA and getting the product out onto the market. Okay? That's not what happens. What happens in 99.9% of the cases is the FDA says, no, you can't market this, and people don't know. They don't know what drugs are in the pipeline. They don't know what drugs FDA delay is causing to be unavailable. And they certainly don't know, okay, what drugs might have helped them or helped their loved ones had they been available. The sensor pad is very unusual in this regard.